You learn to write the letter A with careful, deliberate strokes, the pen guided by your eyes, corrected by your hand, stored by a circuit that was building itself with every letter you formed. You train that circuit every day for the first 15 to 20 years of your life. Homework, exams, letters, notes, lists, signatures, the margins of books. Every handwritten word strengthened it. Then the keyboard arrived. The phone arrived. The pen went into a drawer. And the circuit, the fine motor, visuospatial integration loop that handwriting uniquely activates, went quiet. Not dead. Quiet, unused for years, in a brain that still contains every connection the circuit requires. What that silence costs was measured directly. High-density EEG with 256 channels, far more than standard clinical EEG, revealed that handwriting activated oscillatory patterns across parietal and central brain regions associated with memory. Encoding that typing did not produce, as van der Meer and colleagues documented at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Identical content, identical words, different motor execution, different brain activation, different memory formation. The reason starts with territory, specifically how much of your brain's motor command center the hand controls. Motor command strip running across the top of your brain is organized by body region. Different sections control different body parts. The amount of territory assigned to each part is proportional not to the part's physical size, but to the complexity and precision of its movement. Your hand and fingers occupy approximately 30% of this command strip, more than legs, trunk, and face combined. The disproportion reflects how much evolutionary pressure was placed on fine manual control, tool making, tool use, object manipulation, gestural communication. Handwriting engages this 30% fully. Each letter requires a unique motor trajectory, the pen guided through a specific path of curves, lines, and angles that differs for every character. The command center generates a unique plan for each letter, monitors the execution through visual feedback, and corrects errors in real time. Every word is a sequence of distinct motor programs executed in continuous coordination with visual monitoring. Typing engages a fraction of this territory. Every keystroke is mechanically identical, a finger press of approximately 4 millimeters of travel. The plan for pressing one key is nearly identical to pressing the next same finger action, same force, same displacement. The command center does not need to generate unique trajectories. The 30% that handles the hand's full complexity is recruited at perhaps 5 to 10% of its capacity during typing. The rest is idle. Writing a single word, science, requires 7 distinct motor programs executed in sequence, each producing a different pen trajectory, each monitored visually, each corrected through continuous feedback. Typing the word requires 7 nearly identical finger presses. The complexity difference between writing and typing a word is approximately 10 to 1. This complexity matters because cortical activation scales with motor demand. More complex movements produce more widespread activation, more synaptic engagement, and critically more downstream effects on attention, spatial processing, and the memory encoding that van der Meer measured. Now the feedback loop, because handwriting is a motor act under continuous visual surveillance. Handwriting is a closed-loop skill. The visual system monitors the ink trail in real time, compares it to the intended shape stored in the planning regions, calculates the error between intended and actual trajectory, and sends correction signals back to the command center to adjust the ongoing movement. This runs continuously, updating multiple times per second for the entire duration of the writing. Loop engages 5 regions simultaneously: spatial processing centers, motor planning centers, motor execution centers, visual monitoring centers, and the error correction system that times and adjusts the movement. 5 regions in continuous coordination. Typing, for experienced typists, is an open-loop skill. The fingers execute keystrokes without visual monitoring of the keys. The typist watches the screen, not the hands. The continuous feedback loop that handwriting demands is not engaged. The motor execution is ballistic, planned, and executed without real-time visual correction of the trajectory. The 5-region coordination collapses to a simpler circuit. Difference between open-loop and closed-loop motor execution explains why handwriting feels effortful and typing feels automatic. The effort is the loop, 5 regions coordinating in real time, every letter demanding a fresh integration of motor planning and visual verification. The automaticity of typing is the absence of that loop. The motor act has been reduced to a sequence of ballistic presses that the command center can execute without continuous visual integration. Oscillation data is where the memory consequence becomes measurable and where the argument moves from. Handwriting uses more brain to handwriting encodes memory differently. Vandermeer's data showed the specific oscillation. Handwriting produced significantly greater theta power 4 to 8 cycles per second in the parietal and central regions compared to typing. Theta oscillations in these regions reflect the interaction between the memory center and the cortex that transfers information from working memory into long-term storage. Higher theta power during encoding predicts better subsequent recall. Handwriting produced more theta, typing produced less. The information was encoded at different strengths depending on which motor output delivered it. Mechanism connects back to the motor complexity without re-explaining it. The widespread cortical activation that handwriting produces generates stronger theta oscillations in the encoding relevant regions. The information is processed more deeply not because the writer tried harder, but because the motor act of writing recruited more of the brain's encoding machinery than the motor act of typing. Well, the practical consequence. Because the encoding difference is not academic, it has been measured in exam performance, in note-taking quality, and in the kind of understanding that separates comprehension from transcription. Students who took handwritten notes during lectures performed significantly better on conceptual questions than students who typed, despite the typists recording approximately 30 to 40% more content verbatim, as Mueller and Oppenheimer demonstrated in a study published in Psychological Science. The finding was specific. On factual recall questions, the two groups performed similarly. On conceptual questions, questions requiring understanding rather than recall, the handwriters were significantly better. Proposed mechanism is speed. Handwriting is slower than typing. The handwriter cannot transcribe verbatim, there is not enough time. The slower speed forces the writer to process, summarize, and rephrase the content in real time to keep up. This real-time processing is deeper cognitive engagement. The writer actively constructs meaning while writing rather than passively transcribing words. Typing speed permits verbatim transcription, which bypasses the deep processing that produces understanding. Speed limitation of handwriting is the mechanism, not a weakness. Handwriting is slow enough that the brain must engage deeply with the content to keep up. Typing is fast enough that the brain can disengage from the content and still capture it. The pen forces processing. The keyboard permits passivity. Combination of forced processing and enhanced theta encoding produces a compounding effect. The content is processed more deeply during writing and encoded more strongly into memory by the theta oscillations. The motor complexity generates two independent mechanisms, both favoring handwriting, both absent during typing, both operating automatically without conscious effort. You now know what the pen activates and what the keyboard does not. The question changes from what the circuit does when it runs to what happens when it stops running, because the circuit has been going quiet across 3 generations simultaneously. That convergence, the force processing from the speed constraint compounding the enhanced encoding from the motor complexity, is why I no longer reach for the keyboard when the goal is to remember rather than to record. If you are over 45, the handwriting connection to fine motor maintenance carries specific relevance because the circuit's handwriting trains are the circuit's aging degrades first. Fine motor precision declines with age, finger movements become slower and less accurate. Handwriting becomes less legible. Small manipulations like buttons, clasps, and coins become more difficult. The decline reflects changes at both ends of the system. Reduced motor neuron count and less reliable neuromuscular junctions in the periphery. Reduced command strip excitability and degraded corticospinal integrity in the brain. Daily handwriting provides continuous training of the fine motor circuits that aging weakens. The complex trajectories demand full recruitment of the hand's command territory, the visuomotor feedback loop, and the error correction system. The continuous demand maintains synaptic integrity through use-dependent plasticity. Connections that are used remain strong. Connections that are unused weaken. The principle applies to every neural circuit. The handwriting circuit is no exception. Viewer who switched entirely to typing 20 years ago removed the daily training stimulus for the most complex fine motor circuits the brain contains. The circuits are present, they respond to reactivation, but they have been weakening without input for the years since the pen was abandoned. 5 minutes of daily handwriting reactivates them not because writing is nostalgic, but because the motor cognitive loop it engages has no substitute in the keyboard-based world. If you are over 65 and have noticed increased difficulty with fine manipulation buttons, coins, jar lids, writing your signature legibly, 5 minutes of daily handwriting functions as targeted exercise for the motor circuits that control those tasks. The handwriting itself may not improve dramatically. The fine motor circuits it trains will. And then, what happens to children who never learn to write by hand because the trajectory is now running in both directions? Studies comparing pre-literate children who learned letters through handwriting versus typing found that the handwriting group showed stronger letter recognition, better reading ability, and more robust activation of the reading-related brain circuits when viewing letters, as James and Engelhardt documented. The motor act of forming a letter by hand producing the shape through a complex trajectory creates a motor memory that is linked to the visual representation. When the child later sees the letter, the motor memory is co-activated, producing a richer, multimodal representation than the visual-only representation that typing creates. Implication: children who learn to read and write primarily through keyboards and touchscreens may be building letter and word representations that lack the motor sensory richness of handwritten representations. The representation is visual, only the letter looks identical whether it was typed or handwritten. But the neural representation is different. The handwritten letter is encoded as both a visual pattern and a motor trajectory, while the typed letter is encoded as a visual pattern and a key location. The motor trajectory is a richer code than the key location because it is unique to each letter. The key location is an identical mechanical action for every letter. Parallel runs across the lifespan. Children who never develop the skill miss the motor sensory foundation. Adults who abandon it lose the daily training. Older adults who no longer write lose the fine motor maintenance. Built in childhood, maintained in adulthood, protective in aging, and the keyboard has disrupted all three stages. Your signature is the most rehearsed motor program in your brain, a sequence practiced thousands of times across decades until the execution became automatic. The program is stored in the regions that handle overlearned, automatic motor sequences. When you sign your name, you are not consciously planning each letter. You are triggering a stored program that runs to completion without conscious supervision. Signature quality degrades earlier than other writing when fine motor circuits decline because the signature is executed at higher speed and with less conscious monitoring. Neurologists use signature deterioration as an early marker for motor and cognitive decline because the signature draws on both the automatic program and the fine motor precision that aging affects. The signature that doesn't look like mine anymore is an early signal from the circuits that a sustained practice maintains. Cursive engages the command territory more deeply than print, and the difference reveals what continuous pen contact does to the feedback loop. Print lifts the pen between letters. Each letter is a discrete program followed by a transition. Cursive maintains continuous contact across entire words, linking letters through connecting strokes that require the planning system to prepare transitions while executing the current letter. The planning horizon is longer, the coordination demand is higher. The loop runs without interruption across the full word rather than resetting between letters. Relearning cursive as an adult is a genuine neuroplasticity exercise. The programs stored decades ago are recoverable but rusty, and the reactivation engages the motor learning circuits that new skill acquisition demands. The awkwardness of the first week is the brain rebuilding synaptic connections that were weakened, not erased. The improvement across days is use-dependent plasticity in action. Writing with your non-dominant hand, even for a minute, at the end of a session, recruits the opposite hemisphere's motor territory, producing bilateral activation that no other common daily activity demands. The non-dominant hand's writing is slow, awkward, and illegible. The motor programs are underdeveloped because the hand was never trained. The awkwardness is the training stimulus. The motor command center on the untrained side receives novel, complex demands for the first time in the viewer's adult life. Even 30 seconds of non-dominant writing after 4.5 minutes of dominant writing produces a bilateral training effect that no other 5-minute activity delivers. Without cursive experience, print provides the core benefit. Each letter still requires a unique trajectory. Cursive adds the continuous contact dimension, but print delivers the fundamental complexity, the visuomotor loop, and the theta encoding the evidence supports. Well, spatial memory, because handwritten notes encode spatial information that typed notes cannot. When you write on a page, each piece of information occupies a specific physical location: the margin note, the underlined phrase, the diagram in the corner, the arrow connecting two ideas. The spatial layout is created by you, determined by your decisions about where each element belongs. The spatial processing centers that participate in the feedback loop also encode the location of each piece of content as part of the memory trace. Recall from handwritten notes often includes spatial memory: it was in the upper left, or I wrote it near the diagram. The spatial encoding provides an additional retrieval cue that typed notes cannot offer because typed text occupies a uniform format: identical characters scrolling vertically, every paragraph looking identical, no spatial variation to encode. Handwritten diagrams, mind maps, and margin annotations compound the spatial advantage. The act of drawing connections between ideas with lines and arrows creates motor and spatial representations of conceptual relationships simultaneously. Drawing an arrow from one idea to another on a page captures the semantic content plus a spatial motor representation the brain retrieves through a different pathway than semantic recall alone. And then the emotional channel. Because handwritten communication operates through a dimension that typed communication cannot access, a handwritten letter carries the writer's motor signature, the unique combination of letter forms, spacing, slant, pressure, and rhythm that constitutes individual writing style. The recipient's visual system processes these features as identity markers, recognizing the writer through their motor output the way the ear recognizes a voice. The recognition is preconscious: the recipient knows who wrote the letter before reading the first word. Emotional response to a handwritten letter: the feeling that the writer was here, that effort was invested, that time was given, has a neurological basis beyond symbolism. The recipient's brain processes the motor signature through circuits that simulate observed actions internally. Reading handwritten text produces low-level activation of the motor circuits involved in producing it. The recipient's motor system partially simulates the act of writing the letter they are reading. The simulation creates a sense of the writer's physical presence that typed text cannot produce. Because typed text carries no motor signature, every email looks identical, regardless of who typed it. Grandparent who writes a letter to a grandchild is transmitting a motor identity signature that the child's brain will process through circuits a screen cannot activate. The letter, kept folded in a drawer for years, is kept because it carries the writer's motor presence in a way that no digital message replicates. There is a dimension that the motor and memory data do not capture: the relationship between the speed of the hand and the speed of thought. Typing operates at approximately 40 to 80 words per minute. Thought operates faster than either method. Typing is fast enough to keep pace with part of the thought stream. The fingers can almost capture the ideas as they arrive, producing a transcript of the thinking surface without requiring choices about what matters. Writing by hand operates at approximately 13 to 20 words per minute. The gap between thought speed and hand speed is enormous. The hand cannot capture everything. The writer must choose which idea to record, how to compress it, which words to use, what to leave out. The choosing is the processing. The compression is the understanding. The writer is distilling, thought selecting, prioritizing, and reformulating in real time because the speed constraint demands it. Journaling reveals why the speed-thought relationship explains why handwritten journals produce effects that digital journals do not. Expressive writing about stressful or emotional experiences produces measurable psychological and physical health benefits. As Pennebaker established across multiple studies, reduced anxiety, improved mood, measurable immune function changes. Handwritten journals compound the benefit through the speed constraint. Writing about a difficult experience at 13 words per minute forces the writer to slow down, choose words carefully, construct sentences that compress complex emotional content into a pace the hand sustains. The slowness is processing. The processing is the therapeutic mechanism. Morning pages, free writing by hand upon waking, has persisted in creative and therapeutic practice for decades. The practice works because the motor cognitive loop at morning speed, when the prefrontal cortex is still transitioning from sleep, produces a unique state of engagement: the hand moving slowly, thoughts being compressed into the pace the pen permits. For meeting notes or lectures and want to retain the content, the evidence favors the pen for conceptual understanding despite capturing fewer words. Fewer words, more understanding. The trade-off is real. The keyboard is faster and more complete. The pen is slower and more effective for learning. A practical hybrid exists. Write during the meeting, then type the notes afterward for digital searchability. The initial writing encodes through the motor cognitive loop. The typing afterward provides the digital record. The second pass also functions as spaced retrieval, reviewing, and restructuring the handwritten notes reinforces the memory trace. The hybrid takes more time than the keyboard alone. It produces better understanding than either method alone. Shopping list, written on paper versus the list typed into the phone, reveals the encoding difference at the most mundane level. The handwritten list is remembered more accurately. People who write their list by hand recall more items when they accidentally leave the list at home. The motor encoding created a memory trace the phone note did not. The list on the phone is a backup. The list written by hand is both a backup and a memory intervention. The person who writes a grocery list by hand and then photographs it for their phone gets both the encoding from the writing, the searchability from the image, a historical dimension. Because the pen is not ancient technology. The pen is recent technology. For most of human history, writing was the only writing. The typewriter arrived in the 1870s. The personal computer arrived in the 1980s. The smartphone arrived in 2007. The circuit that the pen activates was the default interface between thought and recorded language for every generation before the current one. The circuit was not designed for cognitive enhancement. It was the only option. The theta encoding, the force processing, the spatial memory, the fine motor maintenance, these were not goals. They were side effects of a technology that happened to engage the brain more completely than any technology that followed it. The keyboard is a more efficient transcription device. The pen is a more complete cognitive device. The efficiency displaced the completeness, and the displacement happened too quickly for anyone to measure what was lost until the oscillation data made the encoding difference visible. Generational divide is sharper than most people recognize. Adults over 45 spent their formative years writing by hand homework, exams, letters, notes, diaries. The motor circuit was built through a decade of daily training. When the keyboard arrived, the circuit was already robust. The transition from pen to keyboard weakened a strong circuit. Adults under 30 spent their formative years primarily on keyboards and touchscreens. Many never developed cursive. Some write by hand only to sign their name, and even that is being replaced by digital signatures. The circuit was never built to full capacity. The weakening is an absence of the strong, not a transition from it. Educational implications are still being debated. Some school systems have removed cursive from the curriculum entirely, treating it as obsolete technology. The motor cognitive research suggests the removal is premature. The skill is not the handwriting. The skill is the circuit. The handwriting builds the motor complexity, the visuomotor loop, the theta encoding, the spatial processing. Removing the pen from education does not merely eliminate a communication tool. It eliminates the most complex fine motor training. The developing brain receives the most robust memory encoding pathway available for written content, and the daily maintenance of a 30% territory of motor cortex that no other school activity engages equivalently. Parallel with walking is instructive. Walking was not designed as exercise, it was transportation. When the car arrived, walking became optional. The health consequences of the transition took decades to measure and are still being reversed through deliberate walking programs. The pen-to-keyboard transition is the cognitive equivalent. The consequences: reduced motor complexity, weaker memory encoding, lost spatial encoding, degraded fine motor maintenance are now being measured. The deliberate reintroduction of the pen is the cognitive equivalent of the deliberate reintroduction of walking, restoring a stimulus the brain evolved to receive daily that a newer technology eliminated. 5-minute recommendation is not arbitrary. It is the minimum duration that produces measurable theta oscillation increase in the Vandermeer data. Longer sessions produce proportionally more benefit, but the relationship is not linear. The first 5 minutes produce the largest activation gain. The curve flattens after 15 to 20 minutes as the motor circuits reach steady-state activation. 5 minutes daily is more effective than 35 minutes once weekly because the daily stimulus maintains synaptic strength that weekly sessions allow to decay between sessions. Consistency of the signal matters more than duration of any single session. The circuit's strengthened through daily repetition, not through occasional extended practice. The 5 minutes do not need to be scheduled, they need to happen. A pen by the coffee, a notebook by the bed. The accessibility of the tool determines whether the practice survives the first week. The circuit does not care what you write. It cares that you write. For joint pain or arthritis, a thicker pen, 12 to 15 millimeters grip diameter, reduces the grip force required. Writing on a slightly inclined surface reduces wrist extension angle. Shorter sessions, 2 minutes twice a day, rather than 5 consecutive, deliver the motor training without exceeding the inflammation threshold. The benefit does not require forceful grip, it requires the complex trajectories at whatever force the joints tolerate. No app replicates the circuit. No keyboard activates it. No touchscreen where the finger traces letters on glass, without resistance, without ink, without the visual monitoring of a permanent trail, produces the full loop because the haptic feedback, the visual trace, and the motor resistance of pen on paper are all components the loop requires. Tablet stylus is the closest digital approximation a pointed instrument on a surface, producing a visible trail, monitored by the visual system. Studies comparing stylus writing on a tablet to pen writing on paper show that the stylus activates the motor circuit more effectively than a keyboard but less effectively than a physical pen. The difference is haptic. The pen on paper produces friction, resistance, and texture feedback that the stylus on glass does not. The motor system uses the friction feedback to calibrate grip force and pen pressure in real time. The frictionless glass surface eliminates this calibration loop, reducing the complexity of the motor control. The brain must perform. The stylus is better than the keyboard. The pen on paper is better than the stylus. The full circuit requires the full sensory environment, the resistance of the surface, the permanence of the ink, the texture of the paper under the pen tip. Write anything for 5 minutes daily. A journal entry, a to-do list, a letter, a summary of something you read or watched. The content matters less than the motor execution. It is the act of forming letters that activates the loop, generates the oscillations, and trains the circuits. Use Cursive, if you remember it. The continuous contact engages the command territory more deeply. If Cursive is lost, print is sufficient, slow is acceptable. Legibility is not the goal. Motor cognitive engagement is the goal. The brain does not care whether the writing is beautiful. It cares whether the pen moved through complex trajectories while the visual system monitored the result. The circuit that went quiet is waiting. The command territory still responds. The visuospatial loop still runs when given input. The theta oscillations still fire when the hand moves through complex trajectories. 5 minutes reactivates the loop. The words on the page are the byproduct. The circuit is the intervention. The pen is still in the drawer. That loop planning, monitoring, correcting, encoding, 5 regions coordinating for every letter of every word, is the circuit I stopped calling old-fashioned once the oscillation data showed what the keyboard was leaving on the table.